Hello again. This is Andy Vining, reading My Mother's Diaries, episode 21. March and April 1951, waiting for spring. By March of 1951, I think everyone at Hiltonbury Farm had become heartily sick of the weather. It seemed to rain endlessly. Day after day, I'd pull back the curtains in the morning only to find more grey skies, more drizzle, more mud, and more puddles spreading across everything in the farmyard. The washing was forever being rushed indoors, and every conversation seemed to eventually return to the same subject. When are we ever going to get out on the land? John was becoming increasingly frustrated. The fields were waiting, the spring work was waiting, yet the weather seemed determined to keep everything at a standstill. So while the rain fell, life carried on indoors. I spent many hours working on a ready-cut rug that seemed determined never to be finished. By now I had been working on it for weeks. Every afternoon I would settle down with it, and every evening I would pick it up again. Just a little more, I kept telling myself. Meanwhile, there were stockings to darn, shirts to mend, and all the ordinary household jobs that never seemed to end. The fires demanded constant attention during the cold weather. One day I spent time gathering coke from the ashes John had spread around. Every little bit helped when there were so many rooms to keep warm. John continued with his endless rounds of meetings, sales, football matches, and farming business. One day he attended a sale in Winchester at Bar End, another a meeting in Romsey, while football remained a regular Saturday ritual whenever weather permitted. Friends and neighbours came and went, as they always did. Marjorie West called, Uncle Stanley arrived with the girls, Judith, Veronica, and George. Joan and Les dropped in frequently, and it was a pleasure to see how much better Les was looking. Only a few weeks earlier, everyone had been deeply worried about him, but now he seemed almost back to his old self, and eventually was able to finish with the doctor altogether. Mother and Bella continued to appear regularly for tea, while Fred seemed permanently on the road between Beechcroft and Hiltonbury, carrying news of one family member or another. At St Boniface Hall, dancing continued to be one of the highlights of the village. I took Mother along one evening, and the dance floor was lively as ever. New flower dances were beginning to take shape, and I spent several evenings planning routines and writing notes. The St Boniface Hall always seemed to bring people together, whatever the weather might be doing outside. By the middle of March, however, family concerns began to overshadow everything else. Poor Betty was taken suddenly ill. Fred called one day to say she wasn't well, and when I went round intending to see her, I discovered she had already been taken to hospital, suffering from appendicitis. Naturally, we were all worried. Thankfully, the operation was successful, and reports from hospital steadily improved. Fred made regular journeys to visit her, and before long she was sitting up and looking much more cheerful. The day I heard her operation had gone well, I finally completed that never-ending rug. I cannot say which news pleased me more. At last it was finished. The weather, however, showed no sign of improvement. The rain continued, then more rain, then even more rain. The fields became increasingly waterlogged, and concern around the farming community began to grow. One evening I wrote in my diary that the weather was becoming seriously and absolutely nothing was being done on the land. For a farming family, those words carried real weight. John would stand looking across the fields and shake his head. Waiting was something farmers were forced to do, but rarely enjoyed. There were lighter moments, nevertheless. One evening, John and Joan Bucket and I attended a dance at the Cadena in Winchester, and had a wonderful time. Another evening we went to the theatre with Frank and Wynne to see Wild Parents Sleep, which was excellent. It was a fast-moving, romantic farce about two brothers, Neville and Jerry Hammond, who invited their girlfriend to the family home, leading to many misunderstandings, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. Then trips to Beechcroft, cups of tea with neighbours, and evenings writing letters all helped brighten the long wet days. Andrew returned home from Salisbury School towards the end of March, and he immediately brought extra life back into the farmhouse. John spent time whitewashing his bedroom ceiling while preparations were beginning for taking him back to school after the holidays. Jennifer continued hunting and riding whenever she could, and one day she spent the entire day out hunting. Then came further family news. Mother herself had to enter hospital for an operation. Suddenly we found ourselves worrying about Mother and Betty at the same time. Visits to hospital became frequent. One day I travelled with Fred and Auntie Bella to see Mother, and despite everything she remained cheerful and determined. Each day brought slightly better reports. Each visit eased our fears a little. Meanwhile, life on the farm refused to stand still. It never does. Near the end of March, excitement arrived in the cowsheds. 2 Jersey heifers calves on the same night. One produced a bull calf and the other a heifer calf. As often happens on farms, they chose a thoroughly inconvenient hour to do it. John and I found ourselves up until 2 o'clock in the morning helping where needed, exhausted but pleased with the outcome. The arrival of healthy calves always lifts his spirits. There was other new life too. Sooty, our little cat, chose the old back stairs above the kitchen as the perfect place to produce 4 tiny kittens. The children were delighted. The farmhouse suddenly seemed full of babies, calves in the cowsheds, kittens under the stairs, and soon another addition to the wider family. On the 26th of March, my birthday arrived in the middle of all this excitement. But there was washing to do, visitors in the evening, and a very little time for celebration. But that was often the way of life at Hiltonbury. The following day brought news that Jack Miller had become the proud father of a baby boy. Spring, despite the weather, was beginning to make itself known. Then, just when we thought winter had finally departed, snow arrived once again on the morning of the 29th of March. Even by Hampshire standards it seemed absurd. And March ended with rain, cold winds, and continued frustration over the farming season. But April, at last, would finally bring change. At first, not much. The rain continued in the opening days of the month. Although reports from hospital were increasingly encouraging, Mother was steadily improving. Betty was recovering well. Then, on the 7th of April, wonderful family news arrived. Betty gave birth to a baby boy. Timothy John Player arrived at 12:30 in the afternoon, weighing 8 pounds 4 ounces. Everyone was delighted. The new baby immediately became the centre of conversation throughout the family. A day later, Hiltonbury hosted another family gathering. This time, it was for Andrew's birthday, the 6th of April. Around 20 people crowded into the farmhouse for his birthday celebrations, mostly family with a few others beside. It was a tremendous success, despite the rain that kept coming down, and by the end of the day I was absolutely worn out, and I fell asleep in front of the dining room fire. The weather finally began to improve. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough. For the first time in months, proper farming work began moving again. John started thrashing, the sounds of machinery once more echoing round the farm buildings. He was delighted simply to be doing something productive. The old rhythm of farm life slowly returned. Marron cockerels arrived from Mr. Cross. The chickens needed feeding. Egg collections continued. Calves required attention. John purchased 2 new pedigree cows from Norman in Hursley. Soon afterwards, he was drilling oats at last, whenever the conditions allowed. The fields were beginning to come alive again, the children enjoying their holidays. Julie Dean spent several days with us and became almost part of the family for a while. Jennifer continued riding and attended the Ampfield Gymkhana, where she won 2nd place in musical chairs and successfully passed her riding D-test. Everyone was immensely proud of her. Andrew's holidays passed quickly too. There were shopping trips into Southampton to buy clothes and some new cricket trousers for him. By now he was growing steadily and seemed forever in need of new clothes. Towards the end of April, Mother's condition improved sufficiently for her to leave hospital. She stayed with Auntie Nora while she recovered, and we all breathed a sigh of relief. After weeks of worry, it felt wonderful to see her progressing so well. The weather, meanwhile, transformed completely. After months of rain came sunshine, day after day. One morning I wrote that the weather seemed too good to be true, and John seized the opportunity. The oats were drilled, thrashing was completed at Flexford, muck spreading continued. Fields that had stood idle for weeks suddenly hummed with activity. Mr. Cross showed me how to prune roses, and I spent a lot of time gardening. The lawn was mown, flowers appeared. Daylight saving began, and the evenings suddenly seemed to get longer. The whole farm felt as though it had been woken from a long sleep. Visitors continued to come and go. Philip and Eric Coates joined us for supper. Wynne spent an evening with us. Joan and Les remained frequent callers. Cross and Den Guppy appeared regularly. Marjorie, Malcolm and Nora all visited. There were endless cups of tea and endless conversations. That was the way of life then. Nobody telephoned. People simply arrived. And we were usually very glad to see them. As April drew to a close, another school term approached. I spent several days sorting Andrew's clothes, mending what needed mending, and packing everything ready for him to go to Salisbury. On the final evening of the month, we drove him back to school. The house always seemed fairly quiet after Andrew returned to boarding school. And coming home back through Plateford, we searched unsuccessfully for old Mr. Bates' house and eventually admitted defeat. We couldn't find it. And by the time we arrived back home at Hiltonbury, darkness was falling. The spring crops were in, the cows and calves were thriving, mother was recovering, baby Timothy had arrived safely, the garden was beginning to bloom, and after one of the wettest starts to a year that any of us could remember, Hiltonbury Farm was finally beginning to feel like spring once again. And so we came to the end of April. Thank you for listening to my mother's diaries, March and April 1951. I'll see you again, or you'll hear me again next week. Thank you for listening.